burial, and resurrection, and it actually spoke of his ultimate rejection by the Jewish people. Open up to Luke chapter 24. Yes, I know that's not what the lesson is on today, but I want to preface it with this. The account that we're looking at in Luke chapter 24, he joins the two guys on the road to Emmaus, and what does he say? Didn't these things have to take place? Last week, Kendall talked about how Stephen was brought into the Sanhedrin. Accusations are made against him that are false. And then the high priest gives Stephen an opportunity to speak, saying, "Are these things true?" I don't know about you, but I've been in front of a judge before, right? For wrongdoing. And I was anxious to plead my case, my defense, to present the information that says, I'm not guilty. But that is not at all what Stephen does. He actually turns the tables on them and says, guess what, guys? I'm not guilty. You're the guilty ones. He doesn't make an apologetic argument to these guys. And many of these guys had seen Jesus for a number of years come into the temple. Maybe some of them were even there when he came as a child. I don't know. But there's history. It's not like this event happens in limbo, not connected to everything else. This is about 2 years after Jesus underwent an illegal trial at night in Caiaphas' home. He is the one who is orchestrating this event behind closed doors in the Sanhedrin. And there are others there that were likely at that secret midnight trial of Jesus in Caiaphas' home. Many of the same accusers are now here. They thought that they had stamped out the people of the way. But when Jesus was crucified, everybody knew where he was crucified, why he was crucified, where he was buried, that the tomb was empty, and over 500 people at one time had seen him alive. These guys were treading on dangerous ground because the evidence said otherwise as to what was occurring. Stephen becomes the prosecutor, not the defendant. He's not on trial. It's the leaders of Israel. Now remember, if you remember this, but back in the Old Testament, particularly in Ezekiel, there's a condemnation of the shepherds of Israel. Woe, you shepherds of Israel! You did not take care of my flock. They were admonished to look for a prophet like Moses, who did those signs and wonders. They said they were looking. They should have known. And yet, they didn't. The Old Testament is what put the Sanhedrin on trial. Before we read our passage this morning, we want to get you kind of involved. So we're going to return to our hand signs, baby. Come on up.
By the way, I don't think we introduced ourselves. We're Arlie and Noemi Francis. For those of you that don't know us, and we're part of the teaching team of 4 couples that teach. So, some of you that have been around for a long time know that we do something called Walk Through the Bible. If you need to take one per person, you could, but maybe one per couple would be better. I'm just saying. This is orange. This is purple. Guys, we do hand signs that help you hook things in the closet of your mind. That's what I call it. All the stuff in your mind, all your memories. Can you hook them somewhere? Let me give you some hooks. So this is history of the Old Testament. And I'm going to do several of them with you today. That's just for you to have if you want to have them at home. But for right now, could you look up here? I'm going to do several hand signs that are the exact ones that Stephen was talking about. Abraham was told by God, go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you. And I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. And those who bless you, I will bless, and the one who curses you, I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. What a promise. Guys, it changed the world. It changed the world. He took Abraham out and he said, look at the stars. Your descendants will be greater than the stars. So our hand sign for Abraham is to grab the stars. 3. And say, Abraham. Do that with me. Abraham. He told Abraham he was going to have a bunch of descendants, and Abraham was already old. When there was no hope, when it was impossible for Abraham and Sarah to have a baby, God gave them a baby. His name was Isaac. Isaac was the son of that promise. So one of those stars you grab and make the baby, and you say Isaac. Let's do them together. Abraham, Isaac. Isaac had 2 sons that were not identical, and they certainly didn't behave the same way either. One was Esau, and one was Jacob. Jacob, he was a trickster, he was cunning, he was a schemer, he was a liar. He lied a lot, and he manipulated a lot. He wrestled with people. He wrestled with his brother, literally in the womb before they were born. And then he wrestled with his father-in-law, Laban, who let him see what the reverse side of being deceived felt like. And he wrestled with God. He physically wrestled with God. I mean, I wrestle with God sometimes, but it's not physical. For Jacob, it was physical. So the hand sign for Jacob is as if we were arm wrestling. Jacob. Let's do the first. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Jacob was blessed. He was still the son of the promise too. And he had 12 sons. 12 sons. There were daughters, but there were 12 sons. One of them became his favorite. And that favorite was also an important person in God's eyes. He went through all kinds of misery. His brothers were going to kill him. But instead they decided to sell him. And they sold him into slavery, into Egypt. He spent years in a dark dungeon, probably thinking that he had been forsaken by God, but he wasn't. God used Joseph to deliver his people. Joseph was set apart by his dad because he gave him a special coat. So our hand sign for Joseph is grab your special coat and say Joseph. Let's review with me. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. I'll be back.
And he said, hear me, brethren and fathers. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he lived in Haran, and said to him, leave your country and your relatives and come into the land that I will show you. Then he left the land of the Chaldeans and settled in Haran. From there, after his father died, God had him move to this country in which you are now living. But he gave him no inheritance in it, not even a foot of ground. And yet, even when he had no child, he promised that he would give it to him as a possession, and to his descendants after him. But God spoke to this effect, that his descendants would be aliens in a foreign land, and that they would be enslaved and mistreated for 400 years. In whatever nation to which they will be in bondage, I myself will judge, said God. And after that, they will come out and serve me in this place. And he gave him the covenant of circumcision. And so Abraham became the father of Isaac, and circumcised him on the 8th day. And Isaac became the father of Jacob, and Jacob of the 12 patriarchs.
Wow, what great reading. Thank you. I know God loves it when his word is declared loudly and firmly. Learn to read the Bible out loud. It's one of the best things you can do in the disciple-making process, is have confidence in delivering God's word, even when we're just reading. Thank you very much. Were Adam and Eve Jews? No. Was Noah and Mrs. Noah and Shem, Ham, and Japheth and their wives, were they Jews?
No.
No. Here's the deal. Was Abraham born a Jew?
No.
No. He's what? A Gentile. In fact, before Abraham, there was no distinction. It's just people. And really, that's kind of what God is doing even today. He's creating a people to follow him. Man, I wish we could get rid of the distinctions, don't you? Yeah. So Abraham becomes the father of what will become known as the Jewish people. But guys, they're not really even known as the Jewish people until you get way down the storyline. They're the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who become the Israelites. And when they return from captivity in Babylon, they begin to be known as the Jews because of the way it ties to the name Judah. Abraham was given an unconditional covenant. God walks the blood path on both of their behalves. Genesis chapter 15. Now here's the deal. Was Abraham acting as a righteous man all the time? No. He's a sinner just like us. And he gets to 75 years of age, another 10 years. He's sojourned in Egypt. He's lied about Sarah. I mean, really. How would you act if he was afraid for his life because of your beauty and he said, she's not my wife, she's my sister, go with that man right over there? You wouldn't take it very well, would you? I don't know, but in our world today, that's probably called human trafficking. Abraham is not a good dude. He has left the land of promise because of his unbelief. And then, shades of the same kind of deal. They decide to help God out. Take Hagar, who we got in that sojourn in Egypt. And Abraham, you have a child with her. And Sarah was fully believing, I'm going to take that child from Hagar, and he's going to be the descendant through whom this promise will be extended. I love the Bible story because it doesn't gloss over the ugly. And that validates it in a lot of ways. It's not just this Pollyanna story. We see real people just like us. And just like Abraham left the land to sojourn in Egypt, what was it prophesied in this particular passage that we were talking about? In Acts 7, 2 through 8. What did it say?
They would be enslaved and mistreated for 400 years.
Yeah. So what happened to Abraham was prologue for what happened for his descendants. Guys, if you look for this pattern, you'll see it happen over and over and over through the scriptures. And if you know what to look for when you're looking at a particular story, just plug it into the pattern to know where it's going. And keep looking. The descendants left the land of promise during time of famine. Just like Abraham had left the land. Baby, you're up.
So during this time that they were in Egypt, it got worse and worse and worse. There was a Pharaoh who didn't remember Joseph, who had never heard of Joseph. And it had been 400 years. And this Pharaoh was threatened because the numbers were so big and he enslaved the people. When I teach this story to children, I try to get them to understand what slaves are. Pretty intense. Pretty intense. And they were slaves. And they cried out for a deliverer. They cried out. And God heard them. And he sent them one. Moses. Moses was rejected the first time he sent them. Moses came back at the age of 80. And the hand sign for Moses is the staff that he carries. So we pick up the staff and we say, Moses. Kind of slam it down on the ground. Moses. Okay? Moses came to Pharaoh and he was the mouthpiece of God. And he told Pharaoh, let my people go. And Pharaoh said, So there were plagues. And they were pretty intense and they got worse and worse. And some affected everyone, but most affected just the Egyptians. The final plague was the worst one of all. The worst one, the plague of death. And Moses was told by God what to do to save his people and what they needed to do to be saved. And it was take the blood of a perfect lamb and paint it on the side of the door, the top of the door, and the other side. And that way the spirit of death would pass over their house and death would pass over their firstborn. So the sign for that is, put your hand over your body. Pass over. So far, Moses passed over. Through a series of miracles, one miracle after another, God saves his people. How they could not remember that for the rest of their lives is beyond me. But he saves his people over and over and over. And eventually, Moses goes to the top of a very special mountain, Mount Sinai, and he receives from God the rules for how to live. The rules for how to be his set-aside people. The rules to protect them. The rules to prosper them. That's what rules do. They protect and they prosper. So, the hand sign for the rules is law. Not the 10 suggestions. The 613 commandments. Law. Moses, Passover, law. While he's on Mount Sinai, he receives the instructions for how to build this big giant tent. And we're going to see a replica of it in a couple of weeks since we're going to be gone February 3rd to the 18th. We're going to see a replica of this traveling tent. It was where God came and dwelt with his people and where they came to worship him. And the tent is called the tabernacle. Tabernacle means to dwell. God dwelt in that house with them, in that tent. And Moses gets the instructions. So, the hand sign for tabernacle is like a little tent. Tabernacle. Okay? While he's giving them these 613 laws, he tells them how to use the tabernacle. He tells them there's going to be a certain tribe that are going to be his priests and they're going to organize the worship. And he tells them that he wants offerings and he wants feasts. Guys, some of the offerings are mandatory. Some of them are voluntary. The offerings are atonement for sin. The offerings, all of them, say, I'm sorry to God. I'm sorry. So one of the hand sign for offerings, put up your hand like you're carrying a tray, offerings. He also gave them feasts, 7 feasts. And these feasts are not saying, I'm sorry. These feasts say, thank you. There are fall feasts and spring feasts. And man, we could do 2 weeks on just the feasts because there's so much important information in the feasts. But the hand sign is like this, feast. So, it's offerings and feasts. Okay, let's go to the middle section. Moses, Passover, law, tabernacle, offerings, and feasts. Can we put them all together so far? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, Passover, law, tabernacle, offerings, and feasts. I'll be back.
She's like Vanna White. Okay, so intentionally, I jumped over a portion of scripture because, or in the material, because Joseph and Moses paint the same picture in a lot of ways. So after we've done the Joseph movement, we move to Moses. So let's talk about them together for a few moments. First of all, Egypt was the archetypical symbol of sin and dominion over the Jewish people throughout the next 1,500 years. In fact, in many ways, it's still the same today. So as Joseph goes into Egypt, being sold by his brothers, having been in a pit, falsely accused, left for dead twice almost, he rises to the second highest position in all of Egypt. In fact, it was kind of like Pharaoh said, Joseph, you the man. And Joseph was the visible representation of Pharaoh. Get the picture? See the parallels? He's raised to this position because he has a prophetic understanding of dreams. And in particular, in this case, Pharaoh's. And because of his wisdom and his demonstrated skill set as being a manager, he is raised to this position and entrusted with securing the crops of the Egyptians for 7 years of plenty, in preparation for 7 years of tremendous famine. And it's during this time of great famine, this time again, when Abraham's family says, we can't stay in the land, we got to go find our sustenance somewhere else. So what do? They go back to Egypt to get food. And who's there waiting for them? Joseph. But they don't recognize him. Don't miss this. On their first trip into the land, Joseph's brothers do not recognize him as the vehicle by which they may be saved. It isn't until they've received their food, gone home, been told, hey, don't come back here again unless you bring the youngest, Benjamin. And they kept Simeon in jail. If you want to get Simeon back, you got to come back. Jacob, when he hears what's going on, he freaks out. I'm not sending you back. Imagine you're that one that's still in captivity in Egypt. That's not going to get me because Benjamin's more important than I am. It's not until they return the second time, after they come to the end of their resources. They're out of food. They're hungry. It's not till they get to the end of their rope that they go back. And what happens? Joseph reveals himself to his brothers on the second visit into Egypt. Pretty crazy, isn't it? And I want you to think about this concept. How will all Israel know that Jesus is actually the Messiah that they've rejected at his first coming? How will they know that? By the witness of Gentiles who make them jealous. And they go, oh my goodness. All those things that Ed and Kurt, everybody else, all these guys have been talking about, it's real. We missed him. Salvation came for the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob at the hands of their rejected brother in Gentile lands. Crazy, huh? Joseph was rejected, and he goes into this Gentile world that eventually becomes the vehicle for feeding his own people. Somebody read for me quickly, please, just so we've got the text in our mind. I don't want to jump over it. Let's read Acts 7, 9 through 16. This is the validation of what we've been talking about. Who would stand up and read that portion? Acts 7, 9 through 16. Thanks, Ed.
Because the patriarchs were jealous of Joseph, they sold him as a slave into Egypt. But God was with him and rescued him from all his troubles. He gave Joseph wisdom and enabled him to gain the goodwill of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. So Pharaoh made him ruler over Egypt and all his palace. Then a famine struck all Egypt and Canaan, bringing great suffering, and our ancestors could not find food. When Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt, he sent our forefathers on their first visit. On their second visit, Joseph told his brothers who he was, and Pharaoh learned about Joseph's family. After this, Joseph sent for his father Jacob and his whole family, 75 in all. Then Jacob went down to Egypt, where he and our ancestors died. Their bodies were brought to Shechem and placed in the tomb that Abraham had brought from the sons of Amor at Shechem for a certain sum of money.
Great. So the story of Joseph is pretty much what I gave you. We did not talk about them returning to the land at a later date under the direction of Moses, who becomes our next figure. Now, as a result of Israel being in captivity in Egypt, 400 years pass. They go from either a family of 70 in one translation, 75 in another. The point is not whether it's 70 or 75. Here in the West, we're so binary. It's got to either be this or that. Oh, wait a minute, we got a mistake here. Well, that isn't true. It could mean your perspective is just different. Jesus, when he cast the demon out of the demoniac in Gerasa, one of the authors of that gospel, of this story, says there are 3 men. Another one says there's 1. Let me ask you a question. If there's 3, is there 1? It's just a matter of perspective. We get so wound up in these things where we think there's discrepancies, and we get on the defensive when people bring these discrepancies and say the Bible isn't accurate. Just relax. There's an answer. Slow down, think about it, and you can give a response. You can give a testimony about the hope that is within you. The issue isn't 70 or 75. The issue is that group of people grew into a company of probably over 2.5 million people over the next 400 years. So much so that they rivaled the numeric size of the Egyptians. Moses, we know the story, man. He was raised in the home of Pharaoh's daughter as prince of Egypt. And he sees his brethren fighting one another. And he decides he's going to intervene, using his power to separate them. I don't know what was going through Moses' mind, but maybe he's thinking, gosh, I was brought into Pharaoh's house so I would be in a position to stop my brothers from fighting and deliver them. I had a lot of crazy thoughts when I was 40 years old. My grandfather said to me once, Harley, don't sweat the small stuff. It's not what you do before you're 35, it's what you do after you're 35 that matters. Wow. It wasn't age 40 that set it up. Moses had a whole life ahead of him still. He's raised in the home of a Gentile. And when he tries to separate his brethren, they do not recognize him. In fact, he begins to fear for his life and flees into the wilderness and is there for another 40 years until he hears the Lord on Mount Sinai. Go back to Pharaoh and demand, let my people go. But they said no. It wasn't until Moses returned the second time that he was actually recognized by his own people. And he confronts Pharaoh through the 10 audio-visual lessons, crowned by the Passover. And they are released from captivity, and they get 400 years of slave wages in one night. Moses wanted to bring unity to his brethren 40 years earlier, but he takes them to Mount Sinai, where they will be united as a covenant people that will then go in and possess the land in a way that they never had before. Moses sees God on Mount Sinai, outside the land of promise. Israel returns. They receive the Mosaic covenant at the base of Mount Sinai, where Moses had gone up the mountain. And God tells him, go back down to the people. Here's what I want you to say to them. It says, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my own possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. What was the first word that I said? If. How'd they do? No. Not good at all. Over and over again, Israel broke the covenant relationship, and yet God continues to pursue them. He continues to live in their midst. Moses even offered himself previously to God as a substitute for the people's sin. You see the parallels? Flip over, if you would, to Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 15 through 19. And somebody read that.
You said Deuteronomy 18, 15 through 19?
Yep, that's right.
The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your countrymen you shall listen to him. This is according to all that you ask of the Lord your God in Horeb on the day of the assembly, saying, let me not hear again the voice of the Lord my God. Let me not see this great fire any more, or I will die. The Lord said to me, they have spoken well. I will raise up a prophet from among their countrymen like you, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. It shall come about that whoever will not listen to my words, which he shall speak in my name, I myself will require it of him.
Whoa. God is telling Moses, after you pass on, I will raise up a prophet like you among the people, and they must listen to you, or him, or they will die. Pretty clear, huh? Pretty clear. Now flip over to Deuteronomy chapter 34, and somebody read verses 10 through 12.
Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, who did all those signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do in Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his officials, and to his whole land. For no one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of all Israel.
So here we are at the end of Deuteronomy. Guys, Moses is attributed the writing of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But Moses didn't write the last two chapters of Deuteronomy. Somebody else closed that record at a later period of time. Since that time, no prophet has arisen in Israel like Moses for all of his mighty signs and wonders. Almost like he said, so keep looking. Someone much later in the period pens that as an epilogue to the Moses story. And I don't think you need to be fearful of the fact that somebody played with the scriptures. God inspired who put that epilogue on it just as he did Moses. It's the final edition that is the completion of it all. That whole book of Deuteronomy was inspired, and somebody was inspired to close that record out at a much later time, probably during the time of the Chronicles. They're essentially saying, keep looking. Yes?
Arlie, I've had a question for you. It's about verse 29,
Mm-hmm.
where Moses fled and became an alien in the land of Midian.
Mhm.
Do you believe that was a delay in Moses' obedience to God, where God had raised up Moses to deliver his people Israel from the Egyptians? Or do you think this was just a way of God and his sovereignty in the fullness of time when God would deliver his people Israel? Or did Moses delay in being obedient because he fled?
Never thought?
Oh, I was just going to say, I think it plays into the timeline of God from when he prophesied to Abraham to that 430 years later when he delivered his people.
Yeah, I think there's a time delay, and I don't necessarily think it's an either or. I think it could be a both and. Okay? We want this binary, it's either this or it's that. People who receive this text were not concerned about that so much. We get so tied up in that. It's this or that. What, they can't both be right. Well, actually, they can.
Yeah.
Okay? They can actually both be right. Here's the point I want to make to you. Israel was told, look for a prophet. Did they? Not really. They looked for a prophet like they wanted, not like a prophet like Moses. Do what he says. Well, if they can't identify him, they can't do what he says, right? So when Jesus speaks, they don't obey. And if you do not do that, you will face exile. That's what's going on with Joseph and Moses. The big narrative behind it. Now, I want to shift real quickly because I love what Stephen does. He is building a tightly defined case against the Sanhedrin and ultimately against the Jewish people who have rejected Messiah Yeshua as well. Somebody read Acts chapter 7, verse 41 through 43. Thank you, Dad.
At that time they made a calf and brought a sacrifice to the idol, and were rejoicing in the works of their hands. But God turned away and delivered them up and served the host of heavens, as it is written in the book of the prophets. It was not to me that you offered victims and sacrifices 40 years in the wilderness, was it, O house of Israel? You also took along the tabernacles of Moloch and the star of the god Rompha, and images which you made to worship. I also will remove you beyond Babylon. How far am I supposed to go? I'm sorry.
That's fine. That's fine. Okay, let's get the picture. It moves from Abraham's call, his sojourn in Egypt, to his descendants' call and sojourn in Egypt because of their unbelief, to their call at Mount Sinai to build this tabernacle and everywhere they go set it up so that the nations will see the glory of the God of Israel and how the people serve him. That's why God calls them in the first place, to be a light to everybody. But what happens? I want you to think back for a moment. Yes, we know about the golden calf, but can you think of another time when somebody called into the land, carried unknown idols with them? Who is it? Yeah. It's Rachel. It's Rachel. She takes the idols from Laban's home and hides them underneath her camel saddle when Laban comes to find them. Doesn't say that Jacob ever purged the camp of those idols. There was this, I don't think it does, there is this constant dalliance with worshiping the other gods of the other nations. And Israel could not stop. It started all the way back at the inception. And so, Stephen, in condemning the leaders, said, our people have always been this way. And even at Mount Sinai, you still had those gods with you. Yes, you brought me sacrifices. But keep your sacrifices unless I get your heart. So, they carry these demonic figurines into the land, serving Molech and the other gods, who even required the sacrifice of children and cult prostitution. Here they've got God in their midst, and they choose to follow other gods. Psalm 106, 36 through 43.
And served their idols, which became a snare to them. They even sacrificed their sons and their daughters to the demons, and shed innocent blood, the blood of their sons and their daughters, whom they sacrificed to the idols of Canaan. And the land was polluted with blood. Thus they became unclean in their practices, and played the harlot in their deeds. Therefore the anger of the Lord was kindled against his people, and he abhorred his inheritance. Then he gave them into the hand of the nations, and those who hated them ruled over them. Their enemies also oppressed them, and they were subdued under their power. Many times he would deliver them. They, however, were rebellious in their counsel, and so sank down in their iniquity.
So the idea here is that God established the building of the tabernacle. David wants to build a temple to give God a permanent residence on earth. And God sanctions the building of that temple. But the issue was never the temple itself. So let's talk about the construction of the temple for a moment through the lives of some guys.
So I'm going to skip the 400 years of the judges. And if you're using that handout, I'm moving over to the back. After the period of the judges, then Israel became a united kingdom for a short period. All 12 tribes were united under kings. So the hand sign is United Kingdom. There were 3 kings. They each were reigning about 40 years. And there were only kings because the people demanded one. They didn't want to have an invisible king, God. They wanted a king they could see and point to and say, look, we're like everybody else. So the first one they got was Saul, who looked really, really good. I mean, he was tall, handsome, he looked like a good king. And he kind of started out like a good king, but he didn't last long being good. Because he eventually took power on himself and took privileges that he didn't have. So his heart was not for God. So the first king is Saul, no heart. Saul, no heart. The second king is David. And Stephen is talking about David in his sermon, so we're going to talk about that a little bit too. David was a flawed man. He sinned, but he repented over and over. And God used him mightily. So David had a whole heart. He had a whole heart for God. His son was Solomon. Solomon started out well. He started out asking for wisdom. He started out wanting to do what God wanted him to do. But it switched. It switched. So by the end, Solomon's writing the book of Ecclesiastes that says, all is vanity, emptiness, there's nothing. Solomon, half heart. Half heart. Let's review. United Kingdom, Saul, no heart. David, whole heart. Solomon, half heart. Solomon had a son who was even worse. And at the end of that United Kingdom, there was a civil war. And the nation split. And there were the northern tribes and the southern tribes, and they become the divided kingdom. The divided kingdom has a whole bunch of kings. Bunch of them. 19 in the north, 20 in the south. The north lasts less time than the south. The north has no good kings ever that followed Jesus, that followed God. The south does. The south does. So for that hand sign, we say mostly bad kings, because they mostly were. During all that period, prophets were speaking. Say, prophets speak. Prophets speak. And they said, turn around. Go back. Repent. What are you thinking? They said it over and over and over. And they were persecuted and they were martyred because the people wouldn't listen. So let's do that section really fast. United Kingdom. Saul, no heart. David, whole heart. Solomon half-heart, divided kingdom, mostly bad kings, prophets speak.
It started out good. God inhabits the temple and you see the glory of God there. But over time, this continued idolatry led to the Holy Spirit, God Himself, the Father, leaving the temple to return at a later date. And by the time of Jesus, that temple had been destroyed. Another temple was built during the time of Zerubbabel. But it didn't even have the Ark of the Covenant. So the sacral system was broken. They needed another Savior. He was coming. They should have been looking. But it was never about the temple. It was never about the temple. It was about God's presence in the hearts and minds of the people. The tabernacle was to move. A continual witness among the nations of who God is, the Gentiles. Yes, He was going to use the Jews, but it was about you and me, guys. And the Jewish leadership didn't want that to happen because they thought it was all about them. So the tabernacle moves, they decide to anchor it in the ground. Not going to move anymore. And before long, the temple itself becomes an idol by the time of Jesus. And boy, the disciples are enamored of the temple, right? Look how beautiful it is. And Jesus says what? Mark my words, destroy this temple, and in 3 days, I will raise it back up. What was He talking about? His own body. But 70 years later, the temple would be destroyed. Why? Because the temple in Jerusalem was temporary. For a particular age. For a particular time and the way God operated during that age. But it was always supposed to be the fact that God would come and reside in His people. Where's the tabernacle guys now? There we go. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we saw His glory. Glory as the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. Guys, that word dwell is tabernacle. It was never about the temple. It was about His people testifying in the world. And the Jewish leadership did not want that. And so, Stephen presents all of this and says, you guys are just like our forefathers. You're just like all of the people before us. They rejected Him time and time and time again, and you're no different than they are. You are guilty. And the time has now passed. Destruction is coming. And it's your fault. The outrage was huge. It was Nazareth on steroids. They couldn't stand the accusation. And they decided to kill Him. Stephen's the first martyr. And what happens? His face glows. Who else's face glowed when they saw it? Moses. Wow. Jesus' own face glowed at the Mount of Transfiguration as He reflected the Father.
He claimed to see the glory of God. Well, at least the writer said that.
They claim?
Didn't it say he saw the glory of God?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Just
And
like
He looked into heaven and He saw what? Yeshua standing up for what He was doing. Wow. The leaders were guilty of not shepherding their people, so Jesus took their place. They became irrelevant. When you have time, read 2 Chronicles 36, 15 through 16, and then read Isaiah 53. Because the picture's painted clearly. And I want to ask you again the same question that Stephen asked the leaders. Because we're waiting for the second return. Didn't these things have to happen? We're waiting for the second return. When Israel will recognize him, we already know him. Make his name known everywhere. Why? Because these things have to happen. And then the end will come. Who will close us with a word of prayer? Thanks.
Fathers, we come before you and just enriched with your word and the promises that you fulfilled. Let us leave this place just in awe of your grace and your mercy, and that we look forward to your second coming, but live out as of living to your glory and according to your word. And may we be in constant fellowship with you through prayer and reading the book of Acts for your glory and for your glory alone. In Jesus' name we pray.